Imagine a king, born into unimaginable luxury, taught that his very bloodline was divine, worshipped like a god by some, but abandoned by all in his final hour. He wasn't a monster, he wasn't a tyrant, yet he climbed the wooden steps to the guillotine, calm, composed, and moments away from becoming history's most haunting cautionary tale. How did the most powerful man in France end up with his head in a basket? What secret betrayals, fatal missteps, and impossible choices led Louis XVI from the golden halls of Versailles to the blood-soaked Place de la Révolution? This is not just the story of a fallen king. This is the story of a world turned upside down, a nation devoured by its own dream of freedom, and a man trapped between the crown he wore and the people he could never truly understand. The sun rose over Versailles like it had for centuries, golden, triumphant, almost smug in its perfection. Inside the sprawling palace, crystal chandeliers caught the morning light, servants bustled in silence, and courtiers bowed low in glittering halls. France still looked like a kingdom bathed in divine favor, but that was a lie. Behind the gilded walls and velvet drapes, something was rotting. Outside, in the winding alleys of Paris, the scent of fresh bread was no longer a promise, but a memory. The people were starving. Taxes had grown unbearable. The nobility feasted while children dug through trash. And yet, at the very center of it all sat King Louis XVI, not a villain, not a tyrant, but a man paralyzed by power. He was more interested in clocks and locks than ruling an empire. He wanted peace, yet couldn't decide how to hold on to it. As the country trembled beneath his feet, he fiddled with keys in his workshop, unaware that every moment of hesitation was bringing the guillotine closer. But the storm was coming. The whispers in salons had turned into rallying cries. The printing presses, once silenced, now roared with revolutionary fire. In the cafes and clubs of Paris, people weren't just talking about change. They were demanding it. The people were waking up, and they wanted a reckoning. Still, Louis sat in Versailles, unaware that the kingdom he ruled was already crumbling beneath him, that every feast, every dance, every decree he delayed was another nail in the coffin of the monarchy. This wasn't just the dawn of a revolution. It was the beginning of a king's final days. France was boiling, and no one in Versailles could hear the hiss of the lid about to blow. The year was 1789, and the kingdom stood on a knife's edge. For centuries, the French monarchy reigned unquestioned. Kings were chosen by God, their word was law, their rule eternal, but nothing is eternal. In a desperate bid to control the chaos, Louis XVI summoned the Estates General, an ancient assembly of the three social orders, the clergy, the nobility, and the commoners. It hadn't met in over 175 years. It was meant to calm the storm. Instead, it unleashed a revolution. When the Third Estate, the voice of the common people, realized they were little more than props in a royal performance, they broke away. They formed the National Assembly and took the fateful tennis court oath, vowing never to disband until a constitution was born. They had stopped asking. They were now demanding. And then, on July 14, 1789, it happened. The Bastille, an old prison and symbol of royal tyranny, fell. But it wasn't just a fortress that collapsed that day. It was the illusion of invincibility. The heads of guards were paraded on pikes, and the streets of Paris tasted revolution for the first time. In the opulence of Versailles, Louis XVI wrote in his journal that day, "Nothing, nothing." As the people tore down stone walls, as gunpowder smoke danced in the air, as the kingdom began to devour itself, the monarchy tried to adapt. Louis wore the tricolor cockade of the revolution. He smiled, he waved, he pretended to listen, but the people had smelled blood, and what they wanted now was not reform, but rebirth. The crown no longer sat on the king's head. It dangled, barely, by a thread, and somewhere in the crowd, amidst the chants and fury, someone whispered, This ends with a king kneeling before the people. What does a king do when he realizes his kingdom no longer belongs to him? The streets of Paris were no longer his to command. The crowds no longer bowed. They watched, they judged, they whispered. The cries for justice were growing louder. The revolution wasn't a storm on the horizon anymore. It was inside the palace walls. Louis XVI was a prisoner in his own land. So, in the dead of night, beneath the flicker of lanterns and the hum of desperate plans, the royal family made their move. June 20th, 1791. The king, the queen, their children, and a handful of loyal guards disguised themselves as peasants and slipped into a waiting carriage. The goal? Montmedy, a stronghold near the Austrian border where royalist troops would protect them. But the escape was no sleek operation. It was bloated, ill-timed, and arrogant. Their carriage was massive, slow, and groaned under the weight of too much luggage and misplaced hope. They stopped for lavish meals, drew attention with odd behavior, and the king's face was unmistakable. It was on every coin in France. And in the small town of Saint-Ménéhould, one man saw that face, Jean-Baptiste Drouet, a humble postmaster. He didn't shout, he didn't panic. He got on a horse and rode ahead to Varennes. By the time the carriage arrived, the trap had already been laid. As the royal family settled into a local tavern, they were surrounded. Soldiers, townspeople, guns. There would be no miracle, no escape, just silence, and the crushing realization that France had caught its fleeing king. Marie Antoinette's knuckles turned white as she clutched her child. Louis sat in disbelief, mumbling to himself. Outside, the whispers turned to chants. Traitor, tyrant, prisoner. The royal family was escorted back to Paris, not in disguise this time, but in full, humiliating view. The journey took days. They were jeered, spat on, cursed. France didn't see a king trying to save his family. They saw a monarch abandoning his people. And with every mile traveled back to Paris, the question became louder. Can a king who tries to flee still be called king at all? He once stood beneath chandeliers that shimmered like stars. Now, he sat in a damp cell lit only by the flicker of a dying candle. Louis XVI was no longer a king. Not in title, not in power, not even in name. The failed escape to Varennes shattered whatever illusion of loyalty remained. The people didn't just lose faith, they felt betrayed. The monarch they believed might embrace reform had tried to flee like a thief in the night. And so the crown was ripped from his head, not by assassins in the dark, but by his own subjects in the light of day. On September 21st, 1792, the monarchy was abolished. France was reborn as a republic. Louis XVI, heir of the Bourbon dynasty, was now simply Louis Capet, a nod to the ancient Capuchin line and a calculated insult. It stripped him of all that made him king, not your majesty, not sire, just citizen Capet. He and his family were moved to the Temple prison, a cold, fortress-like structure in the heart of Paris. Surrounded by stone walls, iron bars, and ever-watchful guards, they lived in silence, fear, and the ticking of a clock that now counted down his days, not his reign. Outside, the air was electric with revolution. Robespierre, Danton, and the Jacobins roared in the National Convention. The streets pulsed with chants, pamphlets, and executions, and over it all loomed one burning question. Should a king who betrayed his people be allowed to live? Louis wrote in his cell. He prayed. He taught his son geography by tracing maps on the cold prison walls, but none of it could stop what was coming. Not now. Documents were found. Letters, correspondences, proofs of conspiracy. Evidence that Louis had plotted against the very people he was sworn to protect. The people didn't want symbols anymore. They wanted justice. And in revolutionary France, Justice came with a blade. Every step he took now echoed with the weight of centuries. What happens when a man born to rule is stripped of everything? Title, power, name? What happens when that man is judged, not as a king, but as a citizen? The guillotine was no longer just a rumor in the distance. It was sharpening its blade. The hall was silent, not with peace, but with tension so thick it could be sliced like the very blade awaiting the accused. It was December 1792. Snow covered the streets of Paris, but inside the National Convention the air was suffocating. No longer was this a court of justice. It was a theater of vengeance. At the center of it all stood Louis XVI, no longer king, now the accused. He did not enter draped in robes. There was no crown, no anthem, just a man, a father, a husband, a former monarch, standing trial before the very people who once bowed to him. He was charged with high treason, conspiracy against the state, and crimes against liberty. The evidence was damning: secret correspondences with foreign powers, attempted flight from the nation, suppression of revolutionary uprisings. The prosecutors didn't just want a conviction, they wanted to make history. And yet, Louis defended himself with calm precision. He denied betrayal, claimed he only sought to preserve peace. He answered each question without rage, without begging, without theatrics. But outside those walls, the people were already screaming for his head. The revolution was no longer an idea. It was a storm, and it demanded thunder, not reason. The question was never truly, is he guilty? It was, can a republic survive while a king still breathes? In one of the most tense and fateful votes in modern history, each deputy rose, one by one, to cast their decision aloud. Days passed. The vote was close, breathlessly close, but when the final tally came in, it was clear. Louis Capet would die, not exile, not imprisonment, death. By a margin of just one vote, the former king was sentenced to the guillotine. He had once been the divine embodiment of France. Now, by a single voice in a sea of revolutionaries, his fate was sealed. And yet, in the days that followed, Louis did not break. He spent his final hours in quiet prayer, bidding farewell to his family, his children, his little son, whom he urged to forgive those who condemned him. What does a man think of in his final days, knowing the people he ruled have become the judges of his death? Does he dream of forgiveness, of escape, or does he simply listen for the distant sound of the blade being hoisted one final time? The stage was set, and all of France held its breath for the fall of a king. Midnight in Paris. The city slept uneasily, as though it sensed the hour of reckoning was near. The stars above blinked coldly, and behind the walls of the temple prison, a king waited for the dawn. It was January 20th, 1793, Louis XVI's last night on earth. There was no feast, no priestly procession, no royal entourage, just dim candlelight flickering over stone walls and the slow, measured breath of a man who had ruled a continent and now faced eternity. They had told him that morning. He would die at 10 o'clock the next day. He did not scream. He did not plead. He simply nodded. That night he requested to see his family one final time. His wife, Marie Antoinette, pale, worn, hollow-eyed from grief. His daughter, Marie-Thérèse, weeping silently, clutching his hands. His young son, Louis Charles, confused, innocent, still believing his father was untouchable. For over 2 hours the cries of a broken family echoed through stone walls. No guards dared interrupt them. No one spoke. It was the sound of an empire collapsing, not with a shout, but with a sob. Louis embraced his queen. He whispered to his children. He placed his hand on his son's head and said the words he would carry to the grave. "My son, never seek to avenge my death." And then, like a man walking into his own tomb, he pulled away. He turned. He walked out of the room. And he did not look back. He spent his final hours in silence, writing, praying, refusing sleep. He asked only for solitude and strength. Outside, the streets of Paris stirred restlessly. The execution platform was being raised in Place de la Révolution, soaked with the memory of others who had fallen. Soldiers sharpened bayonets. Crowds gathered in the shadows, whispering tales of the tyrant who once ruled from Versailles. But inside the temple, a man once called His Most Christian Majesty knelt on the cold floor, clutching a crucifix preparing to meet his God. As the candle burned low, so did time itself. What dreams haunt a king the night before he dies? Does he see the palace of his youth, the faces of the starving, the moment it all slipped away? Or does he see the blade, gleaming in the morning light? The clock ticked on, and with every second, the monarchy faded into history. January 21st, 1793, the day Paris held its breath, and the world watched a throne collapse beneath the weight of revolution. It was cold that morning. Not bitter, but cold enough to feel like fate had clenched the air itself. At 8 a.m., they came for him. Louis XVI stood dressed in white, symbolic perhaps of innocence or sacrifice. His hands trembled only slightly. In the courtyard of the Temple prison, a black carriage awaited. It would carry him not through the gates of Versailles, but to a wooden platform in the heart of a city that once worshipped him. No more golden chariots. No royal guard. Just 4 walls and a guillotine in the distance. As the carriage rolled through the streets, the silence was almost unnatural. Tens of thousands had gathered, not to cheer, but to stare, to witness the fall of the man who once called himself the embodiment of France. Place de la Révolution. The site, once known for its beauty and promenades, was now a place of death. The guillotine stood tall, like some mechanical god of justice, its blade glinting in the pale sun. The scaffold groaned under his steps. Louis turned to his priest, whispered a prayer, then faced the crowd. His voice rang out, not as a king, but as a man unafraid. I die innocent of all the crimes laid to my charge. I forgive those who are the cause of my death, and I pray that my blood may cement the happiness of France. He tried to speak more, but drums rolled loud and fast, on Robespierre's orders. The revolution didn't want words. It wanted closure. He was pushed down. His hands were tied, his neck placed beneath the blade. A heartbeat, a pause. Then, the drop. The guillotine fell with a hiss and a sickening crack. A gasp rippled through the crowd, followed by silence. A silence louder than any scream. The executioner lifted the severed head and showed it to the masses. Some wept. Some cheered. Some simply turned and walked away, forever changed. The man who once ruled by divine right had been reduced to flesh, blood, and silence. The line of Bourbon kings had shattered with a single stroke of steel, but the revolution was not satisfied. Not yet. The death of a king was not the end. It was only the beginning, and in the echo of the falling blade, a question haunted the heart of France. Now that the king was dead, what would become of the kingdom? Louis XVI's execution on January 21, 1793, marked the birth of a new, blood-soaked era in France. His death was not just the end of a king, but the beginning of an unstoppable revolution. The guillotine became a symbol of vengeance, and the reign of terror engulfed the nation. As heads fell daily, the streets of Paris whispered of betrayal, fear, and a future uncertain. The fall of Louis didn't bring the peace the revolutionaries had hoped for. Instead, it birthed chaos, vengeance, and the bloodthirsty drive for power. As the revolution devoured its own leaders, the question remained: had the people freed themselves, or had they simply traded one tyranny for another? The execution of Louis XVI was a moment that would echo through history, an irreversible turning point that reshaped the world.